All right. So we should be live. All right. Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa wala. We start by the name of Allah. We praise Him and ask Him to bestow His peace and blessings on His messenger, His family, His companions, and those that follow. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Thank you all for joining us for our weekly Wednesday discussion. And as a quick reminder, every Wednesday we are going over the book from Dr. Bilal Phillips titled The Evolution of Fiqh, or The Evolution of Islamic Jurisprudence or Islamic Law. And one of the main objectives of us going over this book together is to familiarize ourselves with the concept of fiqh, the history of fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, how it developed over Islamic history, how the different schools of thoughts came to develop in order for us to achieve a respect and understanding of having differences of opinion in religion, different schools of thought. So for the past few weeks, we have been doing an overview of the different schools of thought throughout Islamic history. Last week, we went over the Maliki Madhhab, which is, of course, one of the four major schools of thought. And we're taking our time with this particular section. In the past, we've usually spent one class for each section. This will be, I think, our third or fourth class on this particular section, just in order for us to make sure that we really can take our time to absorb the information, because this particular section is very information heavy. So we're just kind of taking our time going over each madhab in order for us to gain an appreciation for these different schools of thought, right? So inshallah today, we're going to be going over three madhahib, or three schools of thought: the Zaydi madhab, the Thawri madhab, and then the Laythi madhab. And two out of these three madhabs are essentially non-existent anymore. They've essentially been lost to time. And inshallah ta'ala, God willing, we will go over why these schools of thought have been lost to time. But we're going to go ahead and start with the Zaydi madhab that Dr. Bilal Phillips goes over on page 101, for those of you who happen to have the book and want to follow. The founder of this madhab, of course, is Imam Zayd ibn Ali, who is the great-grandson of Ali ibn Abu Talib, of course, the fourth caliphate and fourth of the four relegated caliphs, and of course, the cousin of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace and blessings be upon him. Another fun fact for everyone here is Imam Zayd, of course, is also considered the fifth Imam of the Shiites, which is a different faction of Islam. But the reason why we're discussing him here is his practice and ideology conforms very well and just fine with mainstream Islam. So there's no issues there. So we'll first start with just a quick overview of his biography. As we mentioned, he is the great-grandson of Ali ibn Abi Talib on his son Hussein's side. His father was Ali Zayn al-Abidin, who was a very well-known scholar of his time and a very well-known narrator of hadith. He was born in Medina, and he was eventually known as a very Imam Zayd was a very learned scholar of hadith. He traveled to expand his knowledge in different areas such as Iraq, Kufa, Basra, and Wasit. And These travels that he went through also allowed him to correspond with and have discussions with other very prominent scholars who founded their own schools of thought. So, for example, Imam Abu Hanifa of the Hanafi Madhhab and Imam Sufyan al-Bahri of the Thawri of the Thawri Madhhab, which inshallah we'll go over a little later in this class. And you probably have noticed that a lot of these very prominent scholars have, at the very least, either interacted with other other founders of schools of thought, or even have studied under them. So I feel like it's important to know, because it kind of really emphasized that amongst these different scholars who have founded, schools of thought that a lot of us follow today, they had a mutual respect of one another and even worked with one another and corresponded with one another. They didn't have this disdain or explicit hatred towards other scholars based off their different opinions, which unfortunately what we see today in our Muslim ummah. Like we mentioned in previous sessions, you find Muslims now, of course, not praying to them because they follow a different method and things of that nature, which we know, of course, is absolutely wrong. So I just feel like it's important to mention that we see this continued flow throughout our readings of this book, that a lot of these major scholars and major founders of Madhhab, or the Islamic schools of thought, they either study other founders or even regularly correspond with other founders, have mutual love and respect for one another. Another unfortunate continued flow that we're seeing is just like other scholars. Imam Zayd faced a lot of issues with the Islamic government of the Islamic State of that time, being the Umayyad Empire. As we mentioned in previous classes, the Umayyad Empire, for the most part, was very hostile towards scholarship, that didn't conform to their own state rulings and would conform to their own practices. And Imam Zayd was no exception to this. And considering the fact that he was from the family of Ali ibn Abi Talib, who the Umayyad Caliphate for the most part had a very dark history with, this caused even further harassment of Imam Zayd from the Umayyad Empire. He had to, many times, if he ever wanted to leave Medina, he would need to get permission from the governor, and most of the time that permission was denied. And eventually due to these issues with the Islamic government, this caused Zayd ibn Ali to essentially rise up. And he actually ended up becoming one of the first of the family of Ali to rise up against the Umayyad Empire after the massacre of Karbala with Imam Hussein. And just a quick overview of those of you who don't know about the massacre of Karbala, essentially just in layman's terms, Hussein, the grandson of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace and be upon him, was killed by the Umayyad Empire in Karbala due to him not conforming to that corrupt government. And that's just a very basic, brief, one sentence overview about what happened. But so Imam Zayd essentially is followed his grandfather's footsteps. He was able to get a lot of support from those who are from Kufa, but eventually, unfortunately, they eventually ended up kind of turning their back on him. And there's differences of opinion as to why that happened, and we're not going to go into detail of that because it doesn't play the purpose of this this discussion. But essentially, he lost a lot of the support that he was promised, and this led to him and his support, and those who did stay with him ended up being killed in battle by the Umayyad Empire. Right. So that's just a brief breakdown in history of Zayd ibn Ali, founder of the Sunni Madhhab. So now we're going to go into like, the formation of his Madhhab. And like others, his Madhhab or his school of thought really developed after his death. Um, his he was mainly in terms of the study, he was mainly focused on narration of hadith and recitation of the Quran. He taught in different circles such as Medina, Basra, Kufa, and Wasit, and thus had a large number of students. But like what I mentioned before, he himself didn't really um, dictate his own rulings or methodology. It was mainly his students who did that, and all this mainly happened after he passed away. And this is a I can't think of the word, but essentially this is kind of like a flow. There's a better word than flow, but right now I can think of. Like I mentioned, this is kind of a flow that we've seen that actually Brother Dan and I were speaking about just a minute ago about how a lot of these founders, it wasn't really mainly them that were developing the method as were their students who were taking down their rulings and their opinions and kind of developing it from there. So before we move on, are there any questions?
None here. I'm really new to this.
No problem. And if you're new, all the more reason to ask questions. If anything I said you didn't get, please don't be afraid to ask. Because what we're talking about it can be pretty heavy, but at the same time, I also feel it is important for, especially us as converts, to know this background so we can have a good understanding of how these different schools of thought came to be and why they exist. So please don't hesitate to ask any questions if you have any. So now we're going to go into the sources of law used by the Zaydi Madhhab, the Zaydi school of thought. And just a quick overview for those who are joining us and they haven't been to our previous classes. So obviously in Islamic law or Sharia, there is, of course, sources of law that our Fiqh or our Islamic jurists are used in order to derive laws and rulings. So, and each school of thought have their own sources in which they depend on. And so we're now going into the sources of law that the Zaydi Madhhab utilizes. So of course they use the Quran and the Sunnah. And like you mentioned, every Madhhab is going to use the Quran and the Sunnah as their two primary, most important sources of Islamic law. Sunnah, of course, referring to the actions, sayings, and approvals of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So every madhab is going to have the Quran and the Sunnah as their two primary sources of law. So the third source of law for the Zaydi madhab, if they can't find anything in the Quran and the Sunnah, is known as Aqwal Ali, which basically means rulings and statements of Ali ibn Abi Talib. And for the Zaydi madhab specifically, it was statements that Ali ibn Abi Talib, may Allah be pleased with him, did not say was his own opinion or stance. The way that Imam Zayd saw it, if Ali ibn Abi Talib, may Allah be pleased with him, said something or made some sort of ruling and he did not say that it was based off his own opinion, Imam Zayd would essentially assume that it must have been from Prophet Muhammad as well. And again, to clarify, that's if Ali did not state that it was of his own opinion. So Imam Zayd saw it that if Ali did not say that it was his own opinion, then it must have been from Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. So that's the third source of law for the Zaydi madhab, the rulings and statements of Ali ibn Abi Talib, may Allah be pleased with him. Number four is the ijma' of Sahaba, or the consensus of the companions. We've discussed this source of law before in the past, and like I said, self-explanatory. if they can't find anything in the Quran or the Sunnah, the companions would have a discussion, and whatever what the consensus was amongst the companions in terms of particular ruling, that was considered a legitimate source of Islamic law. Number 5, qiyas, or otherwise known as ijtihad. Essentially, qiyas, again, for those of you who need a quick reminder, is essentially making reasoned rulings based off your interpretation of the Quran and Sunnah. And so that's number 5. And number 6 is a new term that we haven't over yet in this discussion, which is aql. Number 6 being aql. Now, real quick before I define that, is there anyone here who knows the term aql and can define that for us?
Brother Kenneth, aql means the intellect, the human intellect.
Yes, correct. So aql in Arabic means intellect. And so essentially in terms of how this term is used in fiqh or in Islamic jurisprudence, essentially for the Zaydi madhab, if they cannot find anything in the Quran, Sunnah, the sayings and rulings of Ali, the consensus of the companions, or qiyas, they would say that human reasoning, just pure human intellect, is a legitimate source of law. And this idea, and we're not going to spend too much time on this, but this idea of depending on aql or intellect as differentiating between right and wrong was originally founded by this Islamic, or this group of Muslims known as the Mu'tazilites. And I don't want to go into too much detail on that because I don't want to lose anybody. But the Mu'tazilites they essentially were heavily impacted and influenced by Greek philosophy. And a lot of us know that Greek philosophy has like a lot of emphasis on the power of the human mind and human intellect. So those are the 6 sources of law utilized by the Zaydi madhab. And before we move on, are there any questions in terms of the sources of law that we went over with?
Brother Kenneth, I have a question, but regarding the about the madhab, but it's I want to save it for the end, if I may.
Okay, no problem. And inshallah, we can save the question for the end. So up next, we're going to go over just really 2 students of the Zaydi madhab, and these 2 students played a very vital role in the expansion and the preservation of this madhab, or of this school of thought. The first one I want to go over is Amr bin Khalid, who is considered probably the most famous of Imam Zayd's students. He compiled a book of Imam Zayd's teachings, which are known as Majmu' al-Hadith, or compilation of Hadith, and Majmu' al-Fiqh, or compilation of Fiqh, or compilation of Islamic jurisprudence. And together these books are called Majmu' al-Kabir, or the major compilation. And so, this book that Amr bin Khalid developed played a very major role in the preservation of Imam Zayd's teachings and his madhab. And the last student of his I want to go over is his name is Hassan ibn Ali al-Husseini, and he essentially just was known to be the successor and reviver of Imam Zayd's madhab. So the reason why, again, we mention the students, or why Dr. Bilal Phillips is mentioning some major students of these madhabs, is that for us, kind of knowing about these students helps us kind of have an understanding of how these schools of thought expanded and were able to be preserved. So as for today, you're going to find the followers of the Zaydi Madhab almost exclusively in Yemen. And so that's all we really have for the Zaydi Madhab. So now, inshallah, we're going to go into the Laythi Madhab, which the founder is Al-Layth ibn Sa'ad. So Al-Layth ibn Sa'ad, he was someone who was of Persian descent, but was born in Egypt. And he was considered one of like the biggest scholars of Egypt at his time. And he also had a good relationship with Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik, two of the four major schools of thought that we have today. And another very interesting fact about Imam Layth is him and Imam Malik would actually, they would regularly exchange letters together to have like discussions and debates about Fiqh, Islamic law, and other Islamic related subjects as well. And actually would encourage you guys, if you have something better to do it later in the day, if you want to do something, like if you just like type letter of Imam Malik to Imam Al-Layth, you can actually even read some of these letters. It's pretty interesting to kind of see their discussions and the differences of opinion that they had. So again, highlighting these different founders of the schools of thought had good relationships with other scholars of other schools of thought and had respect for each other's differences. So that's really all he says in terms of Al-Layth's biography. That he was he was a major scholar in Egypt, and that he was a contemporary of Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik. Now, the Al-Layth madhab is a madhab that essentially, for the most part, has been lost to time. You're not going to really find practitioners of this madhab anymore. And the next part here, Dr. Bilal Phillips goes into detail as to why this madhab has essentially disappeared. The first reason was essentially the founder of the madhab never really compiled or dictated or instructed his followers to write down his rulings or his sayings. So, like that's number one. He didn't push or ask or encourage his students to, write down and compile his rulings and his own sayings. That's number one. Number two is a lot of his students were not really, or first, a number of his students really he didn't have that many followers compared to other major madhabs, and those who did follow him didn't take positions of influence in their respective areas. As we discussed in previous sections, a big major factor for the growth of many of the Madhhab or Islamic schools of thought was due to the followers of those madhabs being put into positions of authority and influence in the Islamic State. That allowed them to propagate the madhab that they followed and expand that madhab, right? So for the Al-Laythi madhab, he had fewer followers than the other madhabs, and the ones that did follow him didn't take positions of authority and influence. Thus, it didn't really have as much opportunity to expand and become influenced as other madhabs. And the last point he makes that is why this madhab eventually disappeared was Ash-Shafi'i, as we know Imam Ash-Shafi'i, who's one of the four major schools of thought that we know today, settled in Egypt, who of course was the origin of Imam Al-Layth, after Imam Al-Layth passed away, and thus quickly the Shafi'i madhab kind of grew and outgrew the Al-Laythi madhab relatively quickly. So those are like the three major factors that contributed to the fall of this particular madhab, that being, of course, the Laythi madhab. Now, an interesting point that Dr. Bilal Phillips notes here that I want to share with all of you is he mentions that Imam Shafi'i, who also studied under Imam Malik, and a lot of these madhabs actually studied under Imam Malik, which is very, very interesting, I thought, is in Imam Shafi'i's opinion, he felt that Imam al-Layth was actually a more skilled jurist than Imam Malik. But essentially, he felt that his students neglected him, and that's why his madhab came to be. Now, why do I feel like this is worth mentioning? The reason being is, and I mentioned this before in other classes, the reason why I feel this is good to mention is because it highlights that none of these madhahib are inherently or objectively superior over the other, and that's why one is bigger than the other, or one has more followers than another. It's due to other circumstances, and the fact that Imam Shafi'i had the opinion that Imam al-Layth was a more skilled jurist than Imam Malik, who is one of the four major schools of thought today, I think kind of further attests to that, and why it's important for us to have mutual respect for, most, if not all, the authentic madhabs and schools of thoughts that exist today, and those who are of the past. That's why I felt it important to kind of mention that point. So any questions before I move on to the final madhab we're going to be going over tonight? And this last one's not going to take too much time. There's really not much literature about him in this particular book.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
You may have touched on this, but I missed a couple of your earlier halakas on this topic. But so we're talking about the four major schools of thought, and we know that there have been earlier madhabs that have not been preserved, and you touched on a couple of things that may have caused that, like not compiling the information, not enough, maybe there weren't enough followers.
There weren't as many followers of this madhab as other madhabs, and that Shafi'i eventually moved to Egypt, settled in Egypt, where the Laythi madhab was founded. And very quickly, the Shafi'i madhab overtook the Laythi madhab in terms of followers. And that kind of also contributed to the disappearance of this madhab. So we're going over not just the four major schools of thought today, we're going over essentially a big chunk of them. I don't think we're going over all of them, but kind of like a good amount of the different schools of thought that existed over Islamic history. It's important to note that there were not only just four main schools of thought, but right now there's four main schools of thought that are the major ones for today. But over Islamic history, there have been different schools of thought.
And were they geographically based? Is that why some of them were preserved over time, because there was just less followers in the areas where they were?
Yes, geography also played a role in a lot of the expansion of other methods.
Okay, Jazakallah khair.
So yeah, but you don't really have to worry too much about remembering all the different factors. I think it's important for us to note that there are other factors that play to either the growth or the decline of a madhab, not based off of the authenticity of the madhab, not based off the inferiority or the superiority of a madhab, but due to other factors outside of that. And the reason why I think it's important for us to know this is because it's important for us to have a mutual respect for all of these authentic madhahib or schools of thought. And because we don't want to fall into the trap that we see a lot of Muslims falling into today, where you have people who follow a particular madhab, like for example, someone follows the Hanafi madhab, but they won't pray next to someone who's a Maliki madhab, because their madhab is inauthentic, their madhab is wrong, their madhab is going to send them to hell. we shouldn't have that mentality. And that's kind of why I think it's important for us to know the factors that contributed to either the growth or the decline of a madhab. And I'll mention this again, I mentioned this last week too, but I remember I was talking to a friend of mine, a born Muslim. They're of the Hanafi madhab, and they told me that they're kind of scared because they say, what if, I die and then I find out that actually the Maliki madhab or this other madhab was the proper one, and I end up, being punished for it. And I stopped her and I said, look, and the guy, I'm saying this again, guys, Allah is not going to ask you which madhab you follow. All right? The purpose of these madhabs, these schools of thought, is to give us the tools to follow Allah and His Prophet to the best of our ability based off of the resources that are available to us. Right? You're not going to be held accountable for following, a madhab over another madhab, because at the end of the day, all the madhab, the four madhabs today, specifically, all of them are authentic and are considered correct. All of them have, authentic resources and evidences to prove their case. Us as layman Muslims, our only job is to follow based off what is provided to us from these scholars who have dedicated their lives to compiling these evidences and interpreting them based off of their knowledge, just like with anything, just like we know with science. For example, the current pandemic we're in, what are we doing? We're following the guidance and the advice of the CDC because they are the experts who dedicate their lives to studying these viruses, understanding their spread, and then providing to us the evidences and resources for us to protect ourselves. It's the same with it's the same with the madhab, the schools of thought. And this is the mentality I think is important for us to have. Any other questions before we quickly go over the Thawri madhab, which I said, again, there's not really that much that's said for this one, so it'll go pretty quick. All right, so inshallah ta'ala, let's go ahead and move on to the last madhab will be the ninth, which is the Thawri madhab. The founder of this madhab is Imam Sufyan al-Thawri, who was born in Kufa in the year 719 CE. And so just really a couple points of note in regards to Imam al-Thawri is that he also was worked together with Abu Hanifa, was like a colleague of Abu Hanifa, and they had similar views in terms of the use of qiyas or independent deductive reasoning and istihsan. Istihsan, meaning for those of you who haven't been with previous classes, istihsan essentially means preferring other rulings over others based off its relevance to the circumstances facing a particular culture or time period, right? And so last thing I want to mention about Imam Sufyan al-Thawri is just like how many other scholars suffered, he was given the opportunity to be part of positions of authority, but due to the fact that he did not want to support a corrupted government, he turned that down. And like we mentioned in previous sections, when at that historically, if you went against if you went against the government at that time, a lot of times it would either torture your life. And so Imam Thawri was forced to basically flee his homeland for his life in order to not get punished by the government for refusing to take the position of qadi or judge of his particular region. So there are really two main reasons as to why this madhab, the Thawri madhab, doesn't really exist today. Of course, number one, is that a big chunk of Imam al-Thawri's life was spent in hiding. Like we mentioned, the government was basically after his head for refusing to accept his position of a judge. And so he spent a lot of his life up to essentially his death, in hiding to protect himself from the government. And so this made him unable to attract a large number of students who could preserve his work. So that's number one. Number two is, although he did carry out some fairly extensive compilation of hadith and their interpretations, he requested that one of his students, whose name is Ammar ibn Saif, to essentially erase all of his writings. He wanted him to erase and burn all of his writings after his death, thus meaning that there was very little to no preservation of his rulings and his writings. So due to those two main factors, one, he was really unable to get a lot of students due to the fact that he was hiding a lot of his life, and that one of his students was asked after he passed away by the Imam himself to destroy his writings, cause the disappearance of this method or this school of thought. So that's all we have for the Thawri method. So inshallah ta'ala, next week we'll be going over Shafi'i and Hanbali, two of the four major schools of thought that still exist today. And I think maybe two or three more sessions, we should be finished with section 5, and then section 6 we'll go into like why the differences of opinion. And so that's all I have for us today in terms of the head that we're going over. So now I'd like to open the floor for any questions or comments from the audience.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
MashaAllah. Thank you, Brother Kenneth, for your presentation, the halaqah, and the reflection and the teachings that we can have from this. It's very, very beneficial, and it's very important that we know these sorts of histories. So alhamdulillah, may Allah bless you for putting in the efforts to teach us this.
Jazakallah khair.
Alhamdulillah. One of the questions, and it's how do I you said that the Zaydi madhab that is followed in Yemen today. I think it's interesting that that madhab is still considered, or at least is in this teaching of what would be our understanding of Sunni Muslim, which is not across that divide of Sunni and Shia. At that point, though, did this person who was one of the considered to be one of the great imams, was he one of the great imams in regards for like the Shia, where they considered him the fifth one?
Most of them consider him the fifth of the fifth great imam, right?
Okay.
And he is the Zaydi madhab, I guess technically is a Shia madhab. At least I think by most Shiites it is. But it's important to mention that, and I didn't want to go into much detail of this because I think this is a very heavy topic. And I mentioned this before. It's important to understand that the Shiites historically, they were not a different faction of Islam in the beginning. It was more of a political movement. And during Imam Zaydi's time, it was still more of like a political movement. And even when you get down to its essentials, it's the difference between Sunnis and Shiites, at least historically in terms of mainstream, it really comes down to two things, right? At least historically. Number one, who was the rightful ruler after the death of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Those who were of the Shia faction believe it should have been those who are from the family of Prophet Muhammad, aka Ali ibn Abi Talib, may Allah be pleased with him. But the consensus amongst the companions were it would be Abu Bakr. May Allah be pleased with him as well. And so the Shi'is thought that was an incorrect decision. That's number one. Number two, and this is the differences that we see today, and really what caused, and really what some consider a factor is why Imam Zayd lost some support, is the Shi'is, or some of the factions of the Shia today, at least some of them. I mean, there's many different sects of Shiites that have different opinions and different methods, and different ideologies. But essentially, they have this condemnation of some major companions, like Abu Bakr and like Omar. May Allah be pleased with them both. So they have like this condemnation of these two very righteous people, these two very righteous companions. And some extremists even say that it was wrong for them to even be the leaders of the Muslims. Imam Zayd, essentially, he refused to condemn them. He disagreed with some of the decisions that they made, but for the most part, he had a love and respect for them. And so there's an opinion that exists that essentially, due to him not condemning Abu Bakr and Umar bin Khattab, this caused him to lose some support from the Shia faction. Right? And so, but in terms of methodology, Imam Zayd it's the same as mainstream Sunni Islam. Hence why he was included in this book.
Alhamdulillah, Brother Kenneth, thank you for answering that question and giving the background regarding that. Jazakallah khairan.
No way. Any other comments or questions? I know, Sister Jennifer, you said this was your first time joining us. I know you're joining us a little bit heavy into the book. Do you have any questions, or did I lose you anywhere? Okay. If there are no other questions or comments, we can go ahead and close. Jazakumullahu khairan for all of you for joining us. I guess this is going to be our last session before the end of Ramadan. So I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts all our fastings and our good deeds during this blessed month. I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes it easy for us to utilize our time wisely during these last 2 days of Ramadan. And inshallah ta'ala, I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blesses us with a very happy and fun feast. All right. We'll go ahead and close. Allahumma subhanahu wa bihamdik ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Jazakumullahu khairan wa assalamu alaykum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.